Ilhan Omar pointed directly at Senator John Kennedy in a packed congressional hearing room and accused him of representing what she described as America's shameful past, a relic of prejudice sitting in judgment over people whose lives, struggles, and histories he could never understand. She delivered the attack with the confidence of someone who clearly expected Kennedy to retreat, apologize, become defensive, or at minimum spend the rest of the hearing explaining why he was not the caricature she had just constructed in front of a sympathetic gallery. Instead, Kennedy remained seated, quiet, and almost unnervingly relaxed, while Omar continued pressing harder, turning what was supposed to be a policy discussion about refugee resettlement into a personal indictment of the Louisiana senator himself. The progressive activists packed into the room responded exactly as Omar expected, applauding, murmuring approval, and treating each accusation as though the hearing had already reached its conclusion before Kennedy had even begun his response. Reporters watched closely, many apparently expecting the confrontation to become another familiar Washington spectacle in which outrage became the headline and substance disappeared somewhere beneath it. Omar leaned into that expectation, attacking Kennedy's expensive suit, his southern drawl, and what she described as a political career built on excluding people like her from the American dream, while insisting that he could not possibly understand persecution, displacement, refugee camps, or the experience of rebuilding a life in a country where suspicion often arrives before acceptance. She reminded the room that she had fled her homeland, spent years as a refugee, and eventually built a political career in the United States, using that personal history as the central moral argument for why Kennedy supposedly lacked standing to challenge her views on refugee policy. Her supporters applauded again, and for several minutes the structure of the encounter looked completely one-sided, with Omar attacking and Kennedy simply writing on the legal pad in front of him. But Kennedy's silence was not surrender, and the slight expression on his face suggested that he was waiting for Omar to finish constructing the very frame he intended to turn against her. When she finally demanded to know what qualified him to judge policies affecting vulnerable refugees, Kennedy looked up, thanked her for the passionate remarks about struggle and persecution, and calmly suggested that perhaps the committee should examine her own American experience more carefully. That was when Kennedy opened the manila folder sitting in front of him, and the atmosphere shifted immediately because he did not answer Omar's emotional attack with another speech, another ideological argument, or another accusation about motives. He reached instead for the first document and moved directly to the subject of Omar's 2009 legal marriage to Ahmed Nur Said Elmi, a topic that instantly changed the energy inside the hearing room from political theater to something far more uncomfortable. Omar tried to dismiss the subject as irrelevant to refugee policy, but Kennedy's line of questioning in the source script was built around allegations that the marriage itself raised questions about immigration status, family relationships, and later tax filings. He referred to records that, according to the script, connected Elmi's educational background in the United Kingdom with family information contained in Omar's refugee documents, while also pointing to claims from members of the Minneapolis Somali community regarding the relationship. Omar rejected the accusation as a conspiracy theory and described the entire line of questioning as a racist attack, but Kennedy did not abandon the sequence or expand the argument beyond the documents he claimed were already in the folder. He then moved to the shared address issue, laying out lease records, utility records, and voter registrations that the script says placed Omar, Ahmed Hirzi, and Ahmed Elmi at the same Columbia Heights address during the period when Omar was legally married to Elmi. That detail mattered because Hirsi was the man with whom Omar had previously entered an Islamic faith marriage and had children, while Elmi was the man to whom she was legally married beginning in 2009. Kennedy presented the arrangement as deeply unusual, not because unusual living arrangements prove a crime by themselves, but because the source script treated the address records as one piece in a much larger sequence of evidence surrounding the marriage. He emphasized that Omar had children with Hirsi, was legally married to Elmi, and nevertheless appeared through those records to be sharing a residence with both men during overlapping periods. The laughter and applause that had defined Omar's opening attack faded because Kennedy was no longer arguing about ideology, prejudice, or refugee rhetoric. He was forcing the hearing onto a factual timeline that required specific answers. Kennedy then turned to educational records and immigration-related paperwork, arguing that Elmi's student status and ability to remain in the United States were connected to the legal marriage with Omar. According to the source script, he introduced documents involving North Dakota State University and presented them as evidence that the marriage provided practical immigration and educational advantages to Elmi. Omar responded that the material was circumstantial, but Kennedy's method was cumulative, with each individual document intended to reinforce the next rather than carry the entire accusation on its own. He then introduced social media material that the script says had been deleted but preserved through screenshots, focusing specifically on references to Omar's daughter as Elmi's niece, rather than his stepdaughter. Kennedy treated that word choice as another inconsistency requiring explanation, especially when combined with the shared address records and the family name information he had already placed before the committee. The next stage focused on records from the United Kingdom and Omar's refugee application, with Kennedy comparing the paternal names listed in the two sets of documents and arguing that the similarity was too significant to dismiss casually. Omar answered that names were frequently changed or altered during refugee resettlement, a point Kennedy acknowledged before returning immediately to the affidavits described in the source material. He said his staff had obtained sworn statements from 6 members of the Minneapolis Somali community who claimed that Ahmed Elmi was Omar's brother, including one woman who said she had known Omar's family before they fled Somalia. The script presents these affidavits as a central escalation because Kennedy was no longer relying only on public paperwork, naming conventions, or social media language, but on witnesses allegedly willing to make the claim under penalty of perjury. Omar continued denying the accusation, but the structure of the examination left her defending each new item while Kennedy controlled the order in which every item appeared. Kennedy then introduced what the source calls the most damaging item in this portion of the hearing, an alleged 2011 email exchange obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request. In the script, the message from Elmi thanked Omar for helping him get papers and addressed her as sister, while Omar's alleged response referred to family helping family and warned him to delete the messages. Kennedy repeated the word sister because it directly contradicted the explanation that Elmi was simply Omar's legal husband, and he presented the alleged exchange as the clearest statement yet of the relationship he had been trying to establish. Omar called the email fake and fabricated, but Kennedy responded that the material came from official government servers and had been authenticated before being produced. Whether each allegation could ultimately survive independent legal scrutiny was not the question the source script explored at that moment. Inside the hearing narrative, Kennedy's point was that Omar could no longer dispose of the issue with a single accusation of prejudice because he kept answering rhetoric with another document. From there, Kennedy shifted directly into the tax filings, where the chronology became even more damaging within the logic of the source material. He produced returns from 2014 and 2015 that he said showed Omar filing jointly with Ahmed Hirsi, even though she remained legally married to Ahmed Elmi during those years. That contradiction allowed Kennedy to move away from speculation about relationships and toward a concrete legal question, because a joint return requires the filer to represent a marital status under penalty of perjury. Omar's position, according to the script, was that the filings had later been corrected, but Kennedy used that correction against her by arguing that correcting a filing after questions are raised does not erase the original filing. His language remained controlled, but the point was mercilessly simple. If the marriage to Elmy was genuine, the joint filings with Hearsay created one problem. And if the marriage to Elmy was not genuine, the immigration implications created another. The room that had opened with cheers for Omar was now described as almost completely silent, with Democratic committee members checking phones, avoiding eye contact, and trying to understand how far Kennedy intended to take the examination. Kennedy did not raise his voice because he did not need to. The rhythm of the folder was doing the work, one record after another, each introduced only after Omar had committed herself to denying the previous one. He summarized the contradiction as the source framed it: a legal marriage to Elmy, a continuing domestic and financial relationship with Hearsay, shared address records connecting all three, disputed evidence suggesting a family relationship with Elmy, and tax returns filed jointly with a man who was not at that time her legal spouse. Omar's chief aide began whispering to her while her hands visibly tightened around the edge of the witness table, a dramatic reversal from the confidence with which she had accused Kennedy of having no right to question her. The central weakness in Omar's opening strategy had become obvious inside the narrative. She had tried to make Kennedy himself the issue, while Kennedy had waited until she finished and then made the paperwork the issue. Kennedy closed this stage by signaling that the marriage and tax questions were only the first section of the folder, not the conclusion of his examination. He referred to an IRS investigation described in the source script and argued that the issue was larger than a corrected return because the filings intersected with the broader allegations surrounding the marriage. Then he turned the moral accusation back on Omar, arguing that whenever reporters or critics had raised these questions, she had answered by accusing them of racism or Islamophobia rather than resolving the underlying contradictions. His point was brutal because it attacked not only the alleged conduct, but the defense mechanism surrounding it. If every investigation could be dismissed as prejudice, then identity became a shield against scrutiny rather than a reason for equal treatment under the law. Omar said she needed to consult with an attorney, and Kennedy responded with the same, almost courteous calm he had maintained from the beginning, making clear that the committee had not yet reached the next category in his folder. That next category was campaign finance, and Kennedy made certain everyone in the room understood that the tone of the hearing was about to change again. The source script has him warn that the campaign finance section was particularly illuminating, a deliberate understatement after a first round that had already moved from refugee rhetoric to marriage records, immigration questions, affidavits, emails, and tax returns. A recess was called, but the damage to Omar's opening posture had already been done because the woman who had entered the hearing expecting Kennedy to defend himself was now surrounded by attorneys preparing for the next phase of his questioning. Several Democratic seats were described as empty when the committee prepared to reconvene, and the progressive activists who had initially treated Omar's attack as a victory had largely stopped cheering. Kennedy simply reorganized his papers, opened the next section of the folder, and prepared to move from the allegations surrounding Omar's personal and tax history into the money flowing through her political operation. When the committee reconvened, several seats on the Democratic side remained conspicuously empty. Omar returned flanked by two attorneys, and Kennedy opened a new section of the folder marked Campaign Finance, signaling that the questions about marriage and tax filings were finished for the moment, but the financial scrutiny was only beginning. He started with Tim Minott and E Street Group, pointing to Federal Election Commission records that, according to the source script, showed Omar's campaign paying Minott's company roughly $370,000 between 2018 and 2019, during the same period in which allegations about a personal relationship between Omar and Minott were circulating. Omar attempted to separate her private relationships from the business of the campaign, but Kennedy's argument was that the distinction collapses the second political donations begin paying expenses connected to the people involved. He then introduced the divorce deposition of Beth Minette, described in the source as sworn testimony in which she said her husband admitted having an affair with Omar and traveling with her on campaign trips she believed were personal rather than political. Kennedy did not embellish the quoted material beyond what appeared in the source, but he used the deposition to frame the next question with surgical simplicity. If the relationship was personal, why was campaign money allegedly covering the costs? The source script then has Kennedy produce credit card receipts connected to trips, meals, hotels, a Napa Valley spa retreat, and other expenses that he presented as personal rather than legitimate campaign activity, including travel to places where he claimed no campaign event had been scheduled. Omar disputed that interpretation and maintained that the charges were legitimate political expenses, but Kennedy refused to let the argument dissolve into vague claims about consulting, travel, or campaign operations. Instead, he focused on whether donor money had been converted into a private subsidy, because that was the line separating an aggressive campaign budget from conduct that could become a campaign finance problem. Kennedy then connected his phone to the committee audio system and played the message described in the source in which Minette allegedly told his wife not to worry about money because Ilhan's campaign is paying for everything. The phrase landed harder than any technical accounting explanation because Kennedy presented it not as an isolated line, but as another piece that, in his telling, fit the broader pattern already developing around travel, payments, relationships, and campaign money. Kennedy repeated the phrase and asked whether paying for everything sounded like ordinary political consulting, then moved directly to the period after Omar and Minette married in March 2020, where the source says the payments to E Street Group increased rather than disappeared. According to the FEC figures cited in the script, Omar's campaign paid Minette's company roughly another $1.1 million in 2020, making the relationship between the candidate, her spouse, and a major campaign vendor impossible to ignore inside Kennedy's presentation. He described the payment with controlled sarcasm as quite a wedding gift, but the real point underneath the line was much sharper. Once a campaign vendor becomes the candidate's spouse, every dollar flowing into that vendor becomes politically radioactive. Kennedy argued that the issue was not marriage itself and not consulting itself, but whether donor money had been converted for personal use while being presented to supporters as legitimate campaign spending. The source gives Omar no clean escape from that framing because every attempt to reduce the matter to private life was answered with another financial document. Kennedy then turned to findings from the Minnesota Campaign Finance Board, citing the source's figures of $3,469 in campaign money used for personal travel and roughly $1,500 used for personal tax preparation. He connected that tax preparation expense directly back to the corrected returns discussed before the recess, arguing that campaign money had not merely intersected with Omar's political operation, but had allegedly been used to clean up a private tax problem once scrutiny began. Then he introduced another expense described in the source, roughly $6,000 in campaign funds allegedly used to pay a divorce attorney connected to Omar's divorce from Ahmed Elmi. That allowed Kennedy to tie the campaign finance section back into the marriage section without changing the sequence of the original narrative, because the same relationship timeline now appeared again through legal bills and donor-funded expenditures. His attack was not that one questionable receipt proved everything, but that the pattern kept repeating across travel, taxes, legal costs, consulting payments, and personal relationships until the defense of harmless bookkeeping mistakes looked increasingly strained within the script. The progressive activists who had entered the hearing cheering Omar were now described as leaving quietly, while Democratic members who had once appeared ready to watch Kennedy be humiliated instead avoided eye contact, checked their phones, or left their seats entirely. Kennedy remained calm and moved to the next section, asking Omar about Northside Wine Group, a business associated in the source with Tim Minett, and Omar immediately said she had no involvement in her husband's business. Kennedy answered that denial by introducing an investor identified in the script as Naeem Moad, who allegedly put $300,000 into the venture after being promised a 200% return within 18 months, but had not received the promised money several years later. The source then has Kennedy connect the investment dispute to a $1.3 million Washington home where Omar and Minett were living, with the investor claiming that money intended for the business had instead been used to help purchase the property. At that point, the financial allegations moved beyond campaign spending and into a separate dispute involving private investment money, but Kennedy kept the argument focused on the same question he had been asking all afternoon: where did the money actually go? According to the source, Moed stood in the gallery and accused Minett of showing him false contracts and fake wine inventories, while also invoking Omar's congressional position as part of the reason the business supposedly represented a safe investment. Kennedy allowed the accusation to stand inside the hearing narrative, then turned back to Omar and challenged her claim that she knew nothing about a company whose promoters had allegedly used her public position to attract investors. He next produced Omar's 2023 financial disclosure and said it reported between $100,000 and $1 million in income associated with Northside Wine Group, using that disclosure to argue that total ignorance was difficult to reconcile with personal financial benefit. One of Omar's attorneys objected that Kennedy was presenting unfounded accusations, but Kennedy responded with the civil lawsuit described in the source, alleging fraud, breach of contract, and racketeering against Omar and Minett. The script also claims that federal investigators were reviewing possible interstate wire fraud issues, and Kennedy used the existence of those allegations to insist that this was no longer something Omar could dismiss simply by calling the questioning politically motivated. Kennedy then stopped long enough to summarize the financial trail exactly as he had built it. Campaign money allegedly covering travel during a personal relationship. Hundreds of thousands of dollars flowing to Minett's company before the marriage. Larger payments after the marriage. Campaign funds tied to personal tax and legal expenses. And reported income from a private business facing accusations from an investor who said he had been deceived. The argument was vicious because it stripped away every slogan and forced the controversy into the language of receipts, disclosures, payments, and who benefited, leaving little room for the kind of broad political rhetoric Omar had used so effectively at the beginning. He asked what ordinary donors were supposed to think if they had given $20 believing they were financing progressive politics, while their contributions were being connected in the source narrative to spouses, lawyers, travel, consultants, and private financial disputes. Omar returned to the claim that the entire proceeding was politically motivated and that Kennedy was trying to silence a strong woman of color. But Kennedy's patience had visibly hardened by that point. He rejected the identity defense outright, arguing that fraud is not a cultural practice, stealing is not a religious belief, and wrongdoing does not become lawful simply because the accused person belongs to a minority group. For the first time, the source describes genuine disgust entering Kennedy's voice because he shifted from financial questions to what he portrayed as the larger moral damage caused when identity is used as a shield against ordinary accountability. He argued that legitimate refugees, Muslim Americans, women in public life, and small-dollar donors were not protected by lowering the standard for Omar, but insulted by the suggestion that asking her to answer financial questions was somehow an attack on all of them. That reversal cut directly into Omar's opening strategy, because she had begun the hearing insisting that Kennedy lacked the moral authority to question her experience, while Kennedy was now arguing that experience gave her no exemption from answering the same questions anyone else would face. The room, once loud with applause, was now described as discussing resignation, investigations, and political damage, while members of Omar's own staff appeared to understand that the hearing had moved far beyond the policy dispute they had expected. Kennedy then reached for another thick section of the folder and announced that the committee had not yet discussed Omar's statements about Jewish Americans and Israel. The tone changed immediately because the financial sarcasm that had carried the previous section disappeared, and Kennedy approached the next material as something more serious than disputed expenses or questionable campaign accounting. He began with Omar's February 2019 "It's all about the Benjamin's baby" tweet and her reference to AIPAC when asked who she believed was paying American politicians to support Israel, reminding the room that the controversy had already forced an apology at the time. Omar acknowledged that she had apologized, but Kennedy's point was that an apology did not erase the meaning of the language or answer, whether the remark reflected a broader pattern. He then introduced another social media post described in the source, one that allegedly referred to AIPAC as owning Congress and politicians as puppets, using that material to argue that the controversy was not simply a single careless phrase. With Omar already weakened by the marriage, tax, campaign finance, and business allegations laid out before the recess, Kennedy was now moving into the section he intended to present not merely as another political scandal, but as evidence about judgment, prejudice, and whether Omar's public explanations matched what the source claimed she had repeatedly said in less guarded moments. Kennedy then turned from the public tweets to what the script describes as a private fundraiser in Minneapolis in March 2019, introducing an audio recording that he said came from a donor disturbed enough by Omar's remarks to preserve them. In the recording presented in the source, Omar allegedly questioned whether Jewish members of Congress could be trusted on Middle East policy and accused them of putting Israel ahead of the United States, language Kennedy immediately framed as something far more serious than ordinary criticism of a foreign government. He emphasized the accusation of divided loyalty because, in his argument, that was not a disagreement over settlements, military aid, borders, or diplomacy, but an attack on American citizens based on the assumption that their religion made their patriotism suspect. Omar protested that the remarks had been taken out of context, but Kennedy answered by referring to a longer transcript that, according to the script, contained additional statements about Jewish money and political influence. The point Kennedy drove home was brutally narrow. Context could rescue an awkward sentence, but it could not rescue a pattern if the surrounding words pushed in the same direction. He then moved forward to Omar's 2021 comparison involving the United States, Israel, Hamas, and the Taliban, treating that controversy as another example of rhetoric that blurred distinctions Kennedy insisted were morally essential. Omar defended the statement as a call for accountability, but Kennedy argued that democratic governments, however flawed, could not simply be placed on the same moral plane as organizations that deliberately targeted civilians and embraced terrorism as a method. He did not allow the exchange to become a broad debate over every American or Israeli military action, because his purpose in the source was to keep Omar trapped inside the language she had actually used and force her to explain why the comparison had been made in the first place. Kennedy's case was that Omar repeatedly demanded precision and sensitivity when describing Muslims, refugees, or her own political allies, yet showed far less caution when describing Israel, Jewish political influence, or groups hostile to the United States. That asymmetry was where he aimed the knife, because selective sensitivity looks less like principle and more like convenience when it always seems to protect one side and indict the other. From there, Kennedy introduced the Council on American Islamic Relations and immediately pushed the hearing into even more explosive territory, citing material in the source that connected the organization's early history to individuals discussed during the Holy Land Foundation proceedings. He displayed photographs of Omar appearing at CARE events in 2018, 2019, and 2020, and argued that her repeated presence at those gatherings mattered because of the rhetoric and fundraising relationships he was attempting to establish. Omar described CARE as a civil rights organization, but Kennedy's presentation focused not on the label the organization used for itself, but on the associations and court records he said the committee should examine. He then linked those appearances to campaign contributions and argued that it was breathtakingly hypocritical for Omar to accuse pro-Israel Americans of purchasing political influence while accepting support from people tied in the source narrative to organizations sympathetic to causes hostile to Israel. Again, Kennedy's method was cumulative rather than theatrical. One tweet could be dismissed, one fundraiser could be explained, one donor could be called irrelevant, but a chain of overlapping relationships was harder to brush aside with a slogan. Kennedy next introduced State Department and Treasury-related material that the script says documented meetings with representatives of charities accused of functioning as fundraising fronts for extremist organizations, and he claimed Omar continued those contacts even after warnings. He then raised donations from individuals associated with the Qatar Foundation, arguing that Qatar's relationship with Hamas leadership made the financial connections politically significant, even if the individual donations themselves came from American citizens. Omar answered that the donors were legitimate Americans employed by Qatari organizations, but Kennedy refused to let that technical defense end the discussion because his accusations centered on the contradiction between the standards Omar applied to herself and those she applied to Jewish Americans. She had publicly warned about pro-Israel money influencing Congress, he argued, while insisting that money connected to people working within Qatari institutions should be treated as completely ordinary and beyond suspicion. Kennedy's charge was not subtle. If one set of associations justified accusations of corruption and divided loyalty, then she could not demand absolute innocence for another set merely because those associations were politically useful to her. The source then has Kennedy produce a photograph from Omar's 2019 visit to a Palestinian refugee camp, identifying a man beside her as Mahmoud Hassan and describing him as a Hamas operative. Another piece Kennedy used to support his argument that her problem went beyond criticism of Israeli policy. He reminded the room that criticism of Israel was legitimate political speech, and repeatedly distinguished that from what he portrayed as a pattern of anti-Semitic tropes, accusations of dual loyalty, suspicious political associations, and a willingness to minimize the ideological nature of terrorism. That distinction mattered because Kennedy did not want Omar to escape by claiming that any challenge to her language was really an effort to suppress debate over Israel, a defense she had used effectively in previous controversies. He argued instead that the issue was not whether Israel could be criticized, but whether Jewish Americans could be accused of disloyalty, whether financial stereotypes could be recycled, and whether terrorism could be softened whenever condemning it became politically inconvenient. By this stage, even the remaining progressive supporters in the gallery were described as silent because Kennedy had dragged the argument far away from the comfortable territory of policy disagreement and into questions of prejudice and consistency. Kennedy then turned toward Omar's Democratic colleagues, particularly Jewish members who, according to the source, had repeatedly tried to explain why certain phrases and images carried an anti-Semitic history that could not simply be waved away as partisan interpretation. He argued that those colleagues had given Omar opportunities to clarify, apologize, and change her language, only to watch similar controversies reappear later under slightly different forms. Public apologies mattered, Kennedy said in substance, but repeated behavior mattered more, because remorse that produces no change eventually begins to look like political damage control rather than understanding. Omar's defenders had often treated each controversy as isolated, yet Kennedy's entire presentation depended on refusing that isolation and placing the statements side by side until the pattern itself became the accusation. He then announced that the committee had reached the remark that would tie the entire section together, the phrase that had followed Omar for years, and that Kennedy intended to treat as the clearest window into how she spoke about violence directed at Americans. The room shifted again when Kennedy brought up September 11th and acknowledged the family members of victims seated in the gallery, because the hearing was now moving from campaign money and political rhetoric into a national trauma that could not be handled casually without consequences. He referred to Omar's 2019 speech in which she said CARE was founded after 9/11 because some people did something, and Muslims subsequently began losing civil liberties, then prepared video of the full statement for the committee screens. Kennedy's attack was not that Omar had discussed discrimination against Muslims after the attacks, but that she had described the murder of 277 people with language he considered grotesquely detached from the scale and intent of what happened. Omar had long argued that the phrase was being stripped from a broader point about civil liberties, but Kennedy's response in the script was that the wording itself revealed a reluctance to name the perpetrators and the act with the moral clarity he believed the moment demanded. He paused on those 4 words because they had become the hinge of his larger indictment. Some people did something sounded deliberately small when the thing being described was a coordinated terrorist attack that killed thousands. Kennedy then broadened the record by introducing a 2013 Minnesota Public Radio interview described in the source, where Omar allegedly discussed American military policy in the Middle East as part of the conditions that produced violent retaliation. Omar answered that she had been talking about root causes, but Kennedy framed that explanation as another example of shifting attention from the people who carried out terrorism toward the country that had been attacked. He followed with a social media post attributed in the script to Omar on the anniversary of September 11th, in which she allegedly argued that Americans overreacted to the attacks and used them to justify imperialism. The 9/11 relatives in the room were described as visibly shaken, and one man interrupted to insist that his daughter, killed in the North Tower at 23 years old, was not a statistic to be folded into an ideological argument. Kennedy quieted the interruption not to protect Omar, but because he wanted the record completed before emotion overwhelmed the sequence he had spent the entire day controlling. Then came the alleged WhatsApp messages that the source presents as the next escalation, with Kennedy holding up screenshots he said had been authenticated and connected to a group chat among Muslim political activists. In those messages, Omar allegedly described American guilt over September 11th as politically useful and suggested answering criticism with references to Islamophobia and post-9/11 discrimination. Language Kennedy treated as evidence that grief itself had been reduced to political leverage. The accusation hit harder than the earlier disputes because Kennedy was no longer arguing merely that Omar had chosen clumsy public wording, but that the source material portrayed her as consciously calculating how the national trauma could be turned against critics. Democratic members who had remained quiet through the campaign finance allegations now reacted openly because there was no easy procedural explanation for language that, if authentic, sounded less like policy analysis than deliberate manipulation. Kennedy repeated the central phrase about using guilt against Americans and then reached for the next document, making clear that even this was not where the September 11th section ended. The next item in the source was described as material from an FBI security clearance review in 2019, where investigators allegedly raised concerns about Omar's statements regarding terrorism and her attitude toward American foreign policy. Kennedy said the report recorded a statement portraying American foreign policy as the real terrorism and linked Omar to the phrase about September 11th being chickens coming home to roost, an allegation he used to push the hearing from offensive rhetoric into questions of national security judgment. He claimed the interviewing agents had recommended against granting access to classified briefings because of what they considered troubling sympathy for anti-American narratives and an inability to condemn terrorism without qualification. The source then says political leadership overrode those concerns, a claim Kennedy presented as evidence that partisan protection had repeatedly insulated Omar from consequences other officials might have faced much earlier. With the room now fully focused on national security rather than campaign finance, Kennedy reached for the final documents in the section and prepared to argue that the issue was no longer whether Omar had said controversial things, but whether someone carrying that record should continue receiving access to the most sensitive information held by the United States government. Kennedy said the security concerns described in the source did not end with uncomfortable interview notes, because he then introduced a statement attributed to Imam Abdullahi Adam of the Islamic Center of Minneapolis, a Muslim leader whom the script presents as someone who had repeatedly counseled Omar about the damage caused by her rhetoric. The statement said Omar's minimization of September 11th, her reluctance to condemn terrorism without qualification, and her habit of portraying Muslims only as victims were damaging the broader Muslim American community rather than defending it. Kennedy used that testimony carefully because it destroyed the easiest defense available to Omar, namely that every criticism of her language came from conservatives hostile to Muslims, refugees, or immigrants. Here, in the logic of the source, the criticism was coming from a Muslim religious leader inside her own community who insisted that loving America and practicing Islam were not competing loyalties and that condemning terrorism required no surrender of faith. Kennedy's point was mercilessly direct. If Omar tried to dismiss him as prejudiced, she still had to explain why people sharing her religion and community were raising many of the same objections. Kennedy then stood for the first time in the hearing, abandoning the almost casual posture that had defined the earlier questioning and turning toward the 9/11 families seated in the gallery before addressing Omar again. He reminded the room that nearly 3,000 people died on September 11th, including Christians, Jews, Muslims, Hindus, atheists, immigrants, citizens, office workers, police officers, firefighters, and first responders who entered burning buildings while everyone else was desperately trying to escape. His argument was that terrorism did not distinguish among the dead, and therefore refusing to name terrorism clearly did not protect Muslims from prejudice, but insulted Muslim Americans who had themselves been murdered or had risked their lives saving strangers that morning. Kennedy returned to Omar's phrase about some people doing something, presenting it as the culmination of a pattern in which the source repeatedly portrays her as softening language around terrorism while using much harsher language against America and Israel. The confrontation had now moved completely beyond refugee resettlement, the subject that supposedly brought everyone into the hearing room, and into the far more destructive question of whether Omar's judgment was compatible with access to sensitive national security information. The source then has Kennedy produce what he described as a communication from the Director of National Intelligence, stating that Omar's security clearance was being revoked pending a full review, a development he presented as the first immediate institutional consequence of everything discussed during the hearing. According to the script, that action would prevent Omar from receiving classified briefings and from effectively participating in committees dealing with sensitive national security matters, transforming the afternoon from a political embarrassment into a direct limitation on her congressional work. Omar's attorneys objected, but Kennedy continued by saying that the FBI would review allegations involving foreign extremist connections, immigration matters, and campaign finance issues, while the IRS and House Ethics Committee would examine the tax and ethics allegations described throughout the source. He framed the investigations not as punishment imposed by his own authority, but as the institutional response that should follow when a public record contains enough unresolved questions to demand examination. Whether those claims could ultimately be sustained in actual legal proceedings was outside what the source script established. But inside its narrative, Kennedy presented the referrals as proof that Omar's political protection had finally failed. Omar attempted to answer by calling the hearing McCarthyism and describing it as a witch hunt intended to silence a Muslim woman who challenged powerful institutions, returning one final time to the identity-based defense she had used throughout the confrontation. Kennedy rejected the comparison immediately, arguing that McCarthyism depended on accusations without evidence while his table was covered, according to the source, with documents, financial records, emails, recordings, testimony, and government paperwork that he said required answers rather than slogans. He then read statements the script attributes to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Rashida Tlaib, Bernie Sanders, and other progressive figures distancing themselves from Omar and refusing to defend the allegations being presented. The significance was political rather than legal, because Kennedy's argument was that Omar could survive conservative criticism as long as her own coalition continued treating every accusation as an attack on the movement itself, but she could not survive once that coalition concluded that defending her had become more expensive than abandoning her. The source portrays that abandonment as immediate and ruthless, with allies who had previously protected Omar suddenly repositioning themselves before the hearing had even finished. Kennedy then introduced messages the script describes as leaked exchanges between members of the squad, including comments suggesting that Omar had already become a political liability before the day's revelations, and that her rhetoric was damaging the progressive movement. He used those messages to argue that the public solidarity surrounding Omar had been far weaker in private, where political allies were allegedly discussing how quickly they needed to create distance before her controversies damaged them as well. The committee chairman, who had spent much of the hearing trying to restore order, finally addressed Omar directly and said the allegations were serious enough to justify an immediate ethics investigation and consideration of removing her from committee assignments pending review. Omar called the material fabricated and insisted she was being targeted because she was a black Muslim woman, but the chairman, according to the source, replied that authenticated records could not simply be dismissed by repeating the accusation of prejudice. By then, the defense had become circular. Every new document produced another denial. Every denial produced another accusation of bias. And Kennedy's entire strategy had been designed to make that cycle look less like a rebuttal and more like avoidance. The source next has Congressman Jerry Nadler introduce a statement signed by Jewish Democratic members of the House, saying they had spent years trying to explain why Omar's language caused pain and why anti-Semitic tropes could not be excused indefinitely as ignorance. The statement called for her resignation, and Kennedy followed by reading another message attributed to Speaker Nancy Pelosi, saying that Omar had to answer the allegations and that no member of Congress stood above accountability. That moment mattered because the source portrays Pelosi as one of the figures who had previously helped shield Omar from the worst political consequences of earlier controversies, making even a cautious withdrawal of support another sign that the protective wall had collapsed. Omar searched the room for allies, but the script deliberately presents none, transforming the packed hearing that had begun with applause into a room where even her own political side was preparing for survival without her. Kennedy then summarized the allegations one final time, connecting immigration questions, tax filings, campaign expenditures, private business disputes, anti-Semitic rhetoric, terrorism-related associations, and the September 11th statements into the single indictment he had been constructing since opening the Manila folder. At that moment, the source says an announcement over the committee speaker system confirmed the revocation of Omar's security credentials, an almost theatrically timed development that ended any remaining ambiguity about the political direction of the hearing. Kennedy told the room that a member of Congress unable to receive classified information or participate fully in national security work had been severely weakened as a legislator, especially after the cascade of investigations and ethics questions already described. Capitol police officers then entered, and the script says Omar was instructed to surrender her security credentials immediately, creating the visual climax the source had been driving toward from the opening confrontation. Omar protested that the process was not over and promised to fight, while Kennedy answered that the political reckoning had already begun because her allies had abandoned her and the accusations would now move into formal investigative channels. He gathered his documents without celebrating, allowing the image of Omar leaving under escort to serve as the source's final symbol of a hearing in which Kennedy had begun as the target of an ideological attack and ended as the man controlling every consequential question in the room. The hearing ended, but the source continues into the political aftermath, beginning with what it describes as 48 hours of extraordinary silence from Democratic leadership, including only a brief statement from Pelosi's office saying the testimony and evidence were being reviewed. Ocasio-Cortez, Tlaib, and Ayanna Pressley are portrayed as avoiding public defenses of Omar, deleting or removing previous signs of solidarity, and refusing to provide the kind of immediate protection that had followed earlier controversies. Conservative commentators seized on that silence as evidence that Omar's identity had been used for years as a political shield, arguing that legitimate questions about her conduct had too often been dismissed as racism, Islamophobia, or hostility toward refugees before the underlying facts were examined. The source quotes conservative figures making the broader argument that political institutions damage themselves when they treat minority status as proof of virtue, or assume that scrutiny itself becomes discriminatory whenever the person being scrutinized belongs to a protected group. In that framing, Omar's collapse was presented not simply as an individual scandal, but as an indictment of every ally who had once treated criticism of her as morally illegitimate before determining whether the criticism had merit. Within the Somali American community, the source describes a divided response, with some leaders defending Omar as the victim of political persecution, while others argued that any proven misconduct would represent a betrayal of immigrants who followed the law and spent decades building their lives honestly. That division mattered because it again undermined the idea that criticism of Omar could automatically be equated with hostility towards Somalis or Muslims, since some of the most pointed criticism in the script came from people inside those communities. Federal agencies are then described as moving slowly, with no dramatic arrests or immediate prosecutions, only reviews of the allegations and the familiar grinding machinery of investigations that could take months or years. Omar released a defiant video denying the accusations and describing the hearing as an effort to destroy a black Muslim woman who challenged the establishment, but the source portrays that response as far less effective than similar defenses had been in the past because donors, allies, and political organizations were now hesitating. The woman who entered the hearing as a progressive symbol was depicted leaving it under a cloud of unresolved investigations, diminished support, and questions that outrage alone could no longer erase. The final image in the source returns to Kennedy, who was approached the next morning by reporters asking how he responded to Omar calling him a bigot, and he declined to trade insults, saying that he responded to evidence, and that the evidence could speak for itself. He did not launch a victory tour inside the source narrative, and that restraint was used to sharpen the contrast with the furious confrontation that had preceded it, portraying him as a man who believed the folder had already done more damage than another hour of television commentary ever could. Outside Omar's district office, the script describes 9/11 families holding photographs of relatives they had lost, including a retired firefighter who said he wanted nothing more complicated than acknowledgement that his son mattered and that the attack that killed him was evil. The political consequences, investigations, and partisan arguments were left to continue, but the source closes on the claim that the central change could not be reversed. The documents had been placed before the public, the questions had been asked, and Omar could no longer make those questions disappear simply by attacking the motives of the people asking them. Kennedy, in the source's final judgment, did not need to invent a dramatic ending because his entire case rested on the idea that once the folder was opened and the allegations were read aloud, the political protection surrounding Ilhan Omar could no longer keep the controversy contained.